Hello everybody and welcome to Apple IIc Restoration Part 2. And in today's video we're going to be mainly focusing on getting this computer itself and all the accessories looking good. Now, if you remember in the last video, I generally cleaned up the keyboard and everything on this machine as it was pretty gross when I first got it. So I wanted to generally clean up the computer and everything. And I was originally going to include the cleaning of the accessories that came with it as well in that video. But I ended up not doing that because the video was running pretty close to my deadline and I really needed to just get it out. So I ended up cutting this all out of the video for that particular episode. Anyway, moving on now a few months. It's currently June now and I did the original video in December. And basically the difference is you might remember in the first part where I had to do all the retrobrighting down in here for the space key, and even then I didn't really actually finish retrobrighting it. It's still a bit different than the rest of the keys. However, now it's over 90 degrees outside and getting warmer, it seems. As a matter of fact, it's currently 91 degrees. So in today's video, we're going to be heading outside and not only retrobrighting the computer and hopefully as well as the accessories. I'm not sure, though, how large scale I'll be able to take this. But also seeing if we can get this floppy drive working here, which was dead in the last video. So, with that said, that's what we're going to be doing today. So, let's go ahead and get right into this video. Okay, so the first thing we're going to go ahead and take a look at today is the space bar. Now, as you can see, even after my previous retrobrighting attempts, it's still significantly yellower than the rest of the keyboard. So the first thing I'm going to do is pour some peroxide in this little Tupperware container here, and we're going to go ahead and retrobrite this again. I'll also go ahead and add in some water here, as I don't want to use up all my peroxide for just this key, but yeah, I still need the water level, I guess you could say, to be a little bit higher so the key will be submerged. I'll go ahead and dunk the key in here, of course trying to get rid of any bubbles I can to prevent it from floating back up to the top as long as I can. And then I'll go ahead and tape the saran wrap over the top. This will help with the greenhouse effect and increase the general temperature inside this container, which will help with the process. And then I'll go ahead and take it outside. Now, I specifically chose to do this now as these past few days it's been pretty warm. As a matter of fact, at this particular day it was over 90 degrees in temperature, so it's definitely pretty hot outside. So hopefully this will work in our favor here. And I came back out and checked on it a few hours later, and as you can see, the peroxide is already starting to get to work on this key, as you can tell by just how much condensation's on this and how many bubbles are on the key itself. Every now and then I'd have to shake the key around and resubmerge it because of the bubbles that would form, and this became quite a pain. Eventually, I moved the key a bit forward as the sun had started to set, and I needed the area I was originally using was in the shade. However, at this point in time, I pretty much gotten all the good sunlight I was going to get for today, so I decided to just shake the key off and bring it inside and rinse it off. Once it was dry, I went ahead and popped it back on the keyboard, and as you can see, even after just the first day, there's a pretty noticeable improvement in the color. Okay, so as you guys saw earlier, this key has been sitting outside in the sun in hydrogen peroxide for about 3 hours and 47 minutes. Probably a little bit less, a little bit more, but around 4 hours, we'll just say. And honestly, considering the fact that this is just some standard old pharmaceutical grade 3% hydrogen peroxide, I have to say, I'll have to compare it with the pictures and videos I took of it earlier before I started, but it looks like it's transformed a lot in color. It doesn't seem to, it's still obviously a little bit yellow, so I'm gonna have to put it back out tomorrow, but it doesn't seem to be nearly as yellow as it was before. So for 3 hours with 3% hydrogen peroxide, I have to say I'm actually really impressed. So I'm going to take a look at some of the pictures that I took before I started this to compare it and see if it actually is better looking than it was before. But honestly, like on first glance, it does look like it blends in a lot more with the rest of the keyboard. So yeah, so far we're doing pretty good for the first day. So taking a look at those photos, if we go ahead and look at the picture from before, as you can see, there is definitely a very noticeable yellowish tinge to the key, and there's a sharp contrast between the other keys around it. However, taking a look at after the first day, you can see it immediately looks a lot better. It still has a yellowish tinge, but you can see it definitely contrasts a lot less with the keys surrounding it. So overall, I'd say this is definitely worth it. So now that I'm sure this method of retrobrighting works and is somewhat effective, it's time to take this up to a slightly larger scale and retrobright the main case plastics, which as you can see are also really yellow. I already covered the disassembly of this computer in a lot more detail in the first part of this restoration series, which by the way, if you haven't watched it already, I strongly encourage you do. Anyway, we will actually have to remove the speaker here this time, since we will be submerging the plastics in the peroxide. The speaker is actually held in by these 3 tabs, and is glued into place. So, I used a sharp knife to cut through the glue, and then a screwdriver to pry it out of the case. At this point, I have basically disassembled the entire computer down to the bare case pieces, and I also found a perfectly sized clear container to retrobrite it in. Oh wait, notice those cracks at the bottom? Yeah, that totally won't come back and haunt me later. Anyway, the next morning it was time to actually start the retrobrighting process on this. The first thing I'm going to do, and something that is very, very important to do by the way, is remove the Apple logo. I can't tell you how many people I've seen that don't do this and end up damaging the logo. On most 2Cs, including my own, there should be a little hole in the back behind the metal Apple logo insert, and all you really have to do is stick a paperclip or a small screwdriver in that hole, and the logo will really easily pop out. Otherwise, you'd have to carefully drill a small hole behind the Apple logo insert and stick a paperclip there. Anyway, I decided I would do the case in the backyard since I wasn't too keen on the idea of leaving the case out front. I sat the container on some sawhorses that we had and began to fill it with both peroxide and also some water since I didn't have enough to fill the container. I also placed this small paver inside of the Apple IIc to prevent it from floating to the top. This also means that I don't have to check on it as regularly. I also went ahead and threw the space key back into its container of peroxide and set it out next to the other pieces. At this point I put some clean wrap over the top of both containers and let them sit out in the sun. I came out every now and then to check on the space key and submerge it back into the water since it does like to float up to the top of the container as a result of the bubbles that form. Anyway, a little bit later I came back out to check on the case pieces in the space bar, and this is when disaster struck. So remember when I showed you those cracks in the bottom of that container earlier? Well, I had noticed those at the time, however I didn't think they went all the way through the plastic, and just in case I covered them up with some very strong tape. Well, it turns out not only did the cracks go all the way through the plastic, but also through the tape I put over them just in case. And as you can see here, there's just a steady stream of peroxide and water spilling out of the bottom. Unfortunately, this was the only container I had that would fit the size of the Apple IIc case very well, which is the only reason I used it in the first place, so I had to find something else that would work but wasn't as ideal. And then I carefully poured all of the peroxide and water out of the broken container into this new one. So for the most part from this point forward, it was all smooth sailing. At one point I did realize that I forgot to take off the floppy drive bezel, so I had to come back down and disassemble the floppy drive to remove that, and then put it out with the rest of the pieces, which as you can see, I have moved farther and farther away from the house as the sun sets. Later on, I ended up moving it a bit farther onto the gravel, ditching the sawhorses. However, at this point, I had basically gotten all the good sunlight for the day, so I decided it was time to just bring the pieces in. First though, I'll spray them off with a hose to wash off the remaining peroxide. So here are the case pieces after their first day of retrobrighting, and honestly I have to say they do look a lot better already. However, they're not perfect yet. If you look here near the Apple logo, you can see there is still a contrast between where the plastic was exposed and where it was hidden by the logo, so we'll need to put these out a bit longer. So the next day I went ahead and set the sawhorses back out in the yard, and went ahead and sat the bucket with the hydrogen peroxide back on top. I also went ahead and resubmerged the case pieces that I was retrobrighting back into this container. And also, if you thought yesterday was hot, today was no match. The temperature alone outside reached almost 100 degrees, and checking inside the container, as you can see here, the surface of the computer case was over 120 degrees, so this is definitely going to go by pretty quickly. Anyway, checking on it a few hours later, as you can see, there's already some noticeable improvement from when I set it out this morning, so I decided to spray it off and take it inside and take a look to just see how much improvement was made. Okay, so here it is. It's about 5 p.m. on the second day, and as you can see, it's definitely a lot lighter initially, but especially around this front bezel here and on the back here, around this part, you can see it's definitely still pretty yellow. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to flip this upside down and put it back out, just so that we can work a bit on this part of the machine, as this is still pretty yellow. But overall, we're definitely making some pretty good progress here as far as getting this thing retrobrighted. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it back out. So I set the pieces back outside, upside down this time, and came back out to check on them a couple of hours later, and honestly they look a lot better. Granted, not perfect, and there's still some contrast, but at this point I've been retrobrighting these pieces for about 2 days, and I've gotten them basically to the point where I'm basically satisfied with the results. So it's time to go ahead and bring the pieces back inside and dry them off, and then start the reassembly process. So, here is more or less the finished Apple IIc, and honestly, I'm pretty blown away by not only how well this process worked, but also how nice this machine looks now that it's back to its, or very close to its original color. Obviously, there are still some areas, like here on the back, where there's a little bit of contrast, but it's not really worth going any further with the retrobrighting process to remove that, because it already looks pretty good as is, and honestly, this machine looks, it's crazy just how much better this looks now that it's been properly retrobrighted. However, I did also, if you remember at the beginning of the video, promise to take a look at some of the accessories that came with this computer, and one of those happens to be this monitor here. Now, I don't know exactly what specifically the model of this monitor is, but this appears to be the Apple monochrome monitor, as it says here on the back, but I don't really have any distinguishing factors that distinguish it from any other Apple monochrome monitor, because they made several. But basically, this is a black and white monochrome Apple monitor that would have probably come with something, well, like this Apple IIc, or even something like the 2GS, actually, as I believe it shares the exact same case design as some of the 2GS monitors. But I could be wrong. I don't actually have a 2GS to use this with, but I believe it's designed to work with that machine as well. But either way, this is just basically a black and white Apple monitor, and it's a pretty nice monitor. It doesn't appear to have too many hours on it or any kind of burn-in or anything, but it does have some things I want to address aesthetically with it. Yeah, let's go ahead and get into that. Okay, so here's the monitor itself, and it also happened to come with this nifty little dust cover here, which I showed in the first part, but not really in too much detail. And it also came with this very fancy adjustable stand, which you would use if you were using it in combination with something like, well, a 2C, where the computer sits in front of it. I'm guessing if you're using it with something like a 2GS, you would just set the monitor directly on top of the computer and not really use this stand. So that's kind of neat that it came with that. This monitor itself has some gunk and stuff built up in some of the areas here, so I wanted to go ahead and clean it off. And the stand also is pretty dirty in some parts as well. And the vents here at the top are also pretty filthy as well. So in order to tackle this, I'm just going to wipe away at some of these marks here with some just standard old denatured alcohol. This stuff works pretty well at removing scuffs and stuff, so I'll go ahead and use it here. And as you can see, after a few minutes of wiping this down, it's completely gone. I'll also go ahead and clean off the screen itself, and this is mainly just to remove any kind of dust or anything like that that built up on here, but either way, I'm going to wipe that off real quick. Flipping the monitor upside down, you can not only see the stark contrast between the colors, but also this very nifty little stand here. This is what you would use to adjust the monitor's height or angle if you had it on top of something like a 2GS, but this can also be used in combination with the stand if you want the monitor's height to be just a little bit higher or lower. Either way, it's pretty filthy, so I'll go ahead and clean it off, and I'll also just generally clean off the bottom of the monitor as well. And the final thing I'll do regarding the monitor itself is clean out these vents. These were all incredibly dusty, so I needed to get this toothbrush with denatured alcohol in here to clean them all off. And as you can see, there's a pretty big contrast between the cleaned ones here on the left or right and the dirty ones here on the left. And the final thing I'll do is just wipe down the entire top of this monitor with some denatured alcohol just to remove any kind of gunk that just got moved from the side or from the vents to the top. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the monitor itself. So next up here we have its matching stand. Now if you remember, I mentioned earlier that the stand was adjustable. Well, how it accomplishes this is by having these little removable plastic sections here that allow you to change both the height and the angle of the monitor, which is actually pretty neat. Either way, the stand was kind of dirty. I also needed to give it a bit of a cleaning with some denatured alcohol to remove some of these marks and scuffs on it. And the final thing to this monitor that I want to take a look at today is the dust cover. Now, honestly, the dust cover is what carried the monitor's biggest issue to me, and that was the fact that it smelled strongly of perfume. Basically to the point where whenever I walked by that spot of the room I stored this thing in, you could smell it, so I needed to get rid of that smell. The first thing I tried was some of this multi-purpose cleaner we had. I basically sprayed down the entire dust cover in this stuff and wiped it down real good, and honestly it did kind of work, however, not as well as I'd hoped. However, it did weaken the smell quite a bit, and honestly at this point you can't really smell it that much anymore. I also used some of the standard old isopropyl alcohol on some spots to remove some of the crayon and pencil markings that were also on the dust cover. So at this point, the monitor and matching dust cover have been taken care of. However, there's one last thing I want to take care of before we wrap up this video here, and that is this Apple II 5¼ floppy drive. However, if you notice here, it doesn't actually say Apple on it. It actually says Laser, and that's because this actually isn't a Apple branded floppy drive, and it wasn't even intended to be used primarily with the Apple II. This is actually a Laser 128 floppy drive, which, as many of you know now from all the recent YouTube attention this computer has got, is a clone of the Apple II that was manufactured by VTech, actually. I'm not going to go too in-depth into that, but basically, these floppy drives are still compatible with the Apple IIc, as the Laser 128 was actually a clone of this machine. How I ended up with this drive, I don't know. I'm guessing it was just because these were cheaper than the Unidisc drives that Apple was selling at the time, and whoever originally owned this machine decided to purchase the Laser drive instead, or maybe it was from some Laser 128 at some point and got included with the eBay auction or whatever, but somehow I ended up with this drive. I don't actually have the matching computer, but I do have the drive. So, since this was sort of a special drive and not just any old generic drive, I did kind of want to get it working. However, the first thing I did, obviously, because this drive originally did not work with the Apple IIc, is I took the drive apart, I cleaned the heads, I relubed the drive rails, I did all the usual stuff you do, but for some reason it still didn't work on the Apple IIc. So at that point I was thinking maybe it's because there's already a built-in floppy in the IIc, and maybe it just doesn't read disks natively from the external drive by default, and you have to put it in the internal drive for it to boot off that disk. So what I did then was plug the drive into a 2E, which does not have a built-in floppy drive, and it just has the standard Unidisc or Duodisc controller card that uses this type of port. And I plugged the drive into there, and it did do the head-knocking sound that Apple II drives typically do, but it didn't even read or even start or try to read the disk that I put in there. So I don't know if the read heads are just bad or if there's something wrong with the circuitry, but if anybody has experience working on this particular model of floppy drive or maybe knows what could be causing this, feel free to leave a comment down in the description or email me or something like that. But as far as I'm concerned, this floppy drive is dead for the time being. Of course, I'm still going to hold on to it, as this is still a pretty neat item, and it's still kind of cool to have something that would have come with a Laser 128. But unfortunately, I'm not really going to be getting this working in today's video, which is fine because I already have a built-in drive on the 2C, and if this machine miraculously didn't come with a built-in drive, which all of them did, but if Apple made that design decision, then I already have a Duodisc anyway, so I'd still have some kind of floppy option for this computer. So I think for now, we're basically going to be good with this computer. So, for the time being, that basically wraps it up for today's video. I'm very impressed with how we were able to get this Apple IIc cleaned up and retrobrighted, and I think it looks very close to the original condition. And I'm very glad that I was able to turn this Apple IIc from something that was very filthy and very dirty into a nice little computer that's fun to sit down and use sometimes, and definitely looks really good. And it's also kind of neat to have some of these interesting accessories that came with it, both this monitor and the laser floppy drive, as well as the printer and everything else that came with it. Yeah. Also, one other thing I wanted to address is you might have noticed I haven't been making as many videos recently, and one of the main reasons for that is because recently I've been working a lot on changing up this sort of studio space even more than I already had. One of the things you might see here is I redid the desk a bit. I'm not going to get too much into that in this video, as this is obviously supposed to be about the 2C itself, but I do have another bigger video coming up, hopefully within a week or two from now, where I'm going to go more into detail on that and show you the process of all the other things I've done since the last video on this YouTube studio. But anyway, with that said, that's basically all for the 2C in today's video, and hopefully this machine will serve me as a nice little Apple 2C for many years to come. And with that said, thanks for watching. If you're new here, be sure to click the subscribe button and like this video if you enjoyed it. Lets me know I'm doing a good job, and with that said, I'll see you guys all in the next video.